Historia Canadiana is recorded on the unceded lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka First Nation.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to A Cultural History of Canada. My name is Patrick, and with me, as always, is my host who constantly gets kicked in the nards by Australian kids, Mac.
It's like kangaroos, man. They just get back on their little demonic tails and then they kick me in the nards.
It's just nonstop.
It's
Nonstop.
great
You
because I
wake
know
up
my
every
students
day.
listen to this now, so they know that they're kicking me in the nards.
They know that I now say things without actual proof. I just
Yeah.
take your word for it.
Hey, my word's pretty good, man.
Oh, that's fun. I do genuinely love that your students listen to this. It's kind of fun.
Oh, it's so much fun. It's so great. Yay.
As someone who has zero stakes in the fact that they listen to this, it's fun.
Yeah.
Oh god. So sorry, first of all, for consistent listeners, for the delay. Well, as we just mentioned, Mac has been very busy, and I've been away and doing stuff. We just kind of got away
In
from us.
Barcelona.
I was in Barcelona, but also like end of semester shenanigans. Yeah, like we said, just kind of got away from us. So
hmm
we're back. How consistently we're back, I don't know, but we're back.
Probably not for a while since I'm about to go on vacation.
You are, so I'll probably just publish individual episodes, like independent episodes. Yeah.
Yay.
So we'll try to keep it somewhat consistent. So today we're talking about a novel that I think is really cool, right?
Mm.
And that's literally just the point of today's episode, is a novel that
Is
hit it big
cool.
when it came. Yeah, it's cool, but it's not like one of those episodes where we tie it in necessarily to a historical moment like we do with other stuff. I just thought we would talk about a novel that doesn't still today get a lot of play.
Right.
Right. So yeah,
So
it's not a
obviously,
very long novel.
I thought I'd ask you the question. Have you heard of this novel and author before, Patrick? You know, just the way we usually kick off this show before we get into
Uh-huh.
it.
Hmm.
Have you heard of Tae the novel Tae, obviously, that I know? Just want to make it clear for
Yes.
you.
Yeah.
Have you heard of the author, Howard O'Hagan?
I have, actually.
Oh,
This
cool.
is
You
the
learned
only
about him
book
in
of his
school?
that I've read.
You learned about
No,
him in
I
school?
read about
Oh,
him independent. Yeah, no.
fucking nerd.
When I was first starting off in my interest in CanLit, I saw this book that wasn't too long.
Yeah.
And I saw that at least my edition has a bear on it, and it made me think of the novel Bear, and I thought it was going to be the same thing, but no. Unfortunately, it's much sexual.
Yes, it's a Canlit toy for a Canlit boy.
I still think that's one of the best things we've ever said on this show.
Uh, God.
So yes, I've read this. This is actually the only book, Tejon, that I've read of Howard O'Hagan's, and that's actually pretty standard. Like, this is easily his most successful book.
Yeah.
And he wrote other things in his life which were apparently quite good, just not very successful. So we're just going to kind of focus on this book, talk about why it hit in the moment that it did, and just parse out some passages as to give readers a sense of what it's trying to do as a text, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, obviously you've never read this.
No.
No.
No. Fuck no.
Which is fine. Again, totally okay. But yeah, that's that. Just full disclosure here, listeners. Mac does not read these texts.
I
Sometimes.
just teach English. I don't read it.
Classic. The number of times you can get away with that. What do you guys think the story was? You know, like what would you think are the themes, and you just kind of go from there. Yeah.
The book Tejon.
Or just in general.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean,
That's
listen,
just-
if you say like, okay, this is really bad, but if the author's a woman and you say feminism, you're right 90% of the time. And I
Even
feel
if
like
you're
your
wrong,
partner,
you can be right.
yeah, I feel like your partner would back me up on that one. You know, like gender's in there somewhere.
Yeah, genders it's like it's either feminist or anti-feminist, and you can kind of like get a really broad stroke.
And you can get a lot of distance and mileage out of that one. And then you just gotta look at the country. If the book's from America, it's about resistance in some way. It's about revolutions and the independent man. If it's from Canada, it's about like society, community, being part of moving into a community, being part of a small community in a larger world. If it's from England, it's about social norms, social hierarchies, and if it's from Russia, it's about pain.
So, students of Max, for those of you listening, if ever you want like a freebie in his class, listen to what he just said. Also, I'll add, if it was written by a non-white author, male or female, throw around the word post-colonial, and you'll get an A+ in the class.
Oh, they already know that one.
Okay, good.
That's the other thing. Like, you just gotta look at the time period. You don't need to. You don't need to read books. They're all about the same damn thing. Okay.
That's not true, but okay.
Listen, all right. The Chronicles of Narnia is the same as the Bible. Okay, like it's all Jesus allegory.
C.S. Lewis was a hardcore Catholic.
Superman is Jesus. Batman is Moses. It's all the same damn thing.
Yes, but no. This is not the place for this. Oh, God. Okay. So, just a bit of context. So, this novel, Tejon, was published in 1939. So, that's kind of the reason why I wanted to talk about it now, is because we're roughly in the World War II era as far as our broad chronology is concerned. Right?
Love me some World War II.
Yeah, and it is kind of interesting that this novel was written around that time. If I remember correctly, it was published just before the war broke out. I actually don't remember. But it's kind of interesting as a snapshot, a very brief snapshot as to what literature was like in Canada, or was starting to become just before war broke out, and kind of tore everything down. Because for the next 5 or 6 years, literature became once again very romantic and very centered around war, one or the other, right? And it just was not what this novel is. So it is a very, very interesting piece of, like, you start to see the development of this weird surrealist, modernist, postmodern even type of literature, and then it's very quickly cut down, only for authors to pick it back up again after the war.
Yeah.
I don't know. So we've talked about postmodern art before.
So
Matt,
what we're gonna do today?
Yeah.
We're gonna bring it back to Michael Ondaatje.
Please. He actually wrote the afterword to this book.
I know. I read the notes. I don't read the book, but I read the notes. Remember, for all you aspiring English literature students, I did basically my whole degree without reading the books, and I got an A- average. University's a scam.
Sometimes.
Go to trades, get a trade.
Yeah, if you want an actual job, like a secure position, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
If you want to do what you love, don't.
Okay, mister, I'm starving. Let's all calm down. Maybe they love cutting wood, okay?
That's true.
We can't make fun of trades. Jesus was a carpenter. Jesus wasn't no goddamn academic.
That is true.
Jesus did not attend the University of Nazareth.
Jesus was no goddamn academic, but he still fucked with the bankers like academics do.
Yeah, you guys really go hard against the bankers. You guys are really running the revolution out here.
Some do. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Talk about Michael Ondaatje for a bit.
So, yeah. I'm so tired.
That's the perfect time to talk about postmodernism.
I know, it makes it great. And that's why I think it's so funny that we're doing this episode on this guy you have titled as the writer Canadian literature forgot, and we can't seem to talk about him at all.
So, to catch people up, Mac, while I pull up my notes, in 3 words or less, what is postmodernism?
It's not art.
Oh, that's good. That's good. Okay.
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Don't elaborate.
I think that makes sense.
If you want more information on that, go back to our episode that we did on In the Skin of the Lion. You'll get a lot more of an explanation.
Oh, I
there.
can like if I really want to, I could deep dive into what
No, it's
postmodernism
fine.
is. But like postmodernism both is and is not art.
Yeah,
It both is
that's
and
it.
is not it both is and is not postmodernism.
Mm-hmm. Good. It's contradictions internalized.
It's the
Great. We'll move
thing,
on.
it's also the painting of the thing, it's the painting of the thing, like, and I mean that both in use of the word painting as a verb and as a noun
Yeah.
at the
Yeah.
same.
Yeah.
It is
For
both
sure.
the rabbit and the duck.
Yeah. Absolutely. Good. It's not a pipe, but it's a pipe.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, if I was going to describe
Um,
postmodernism in 3 words, rabbit and duck.
good. Great. So Howard O'Hagan, right? As you were saying, like he's been called variously like the writer that Canadian literature forgot, or somewhat of an underdog, or
Or just never
um,
learned in the first place.
yeah, or never learned in the first place, right? It kind of really depends who you had as a teacher or what kind of literature you happened to fall upon.
Or what book cover you saw that you thought was a bear.
Yeah, exactly. I can't wait to actually talk about Bear on the show. It's great.
Okay.
It genuinely is awesome. But anyway, so O'Hagan was a prairie writer. He was born in Alberta, in Lethbridge. And he actually studied law at McGill University in the 1920s, right? In the late 1920s. And over there, what's interesting is that he did develop a friendship with other writers that were really big at the time. We've talked about Stephen Leacock before,
Ooh.
for example. So he
The one
developed
book I've actually read on this show.
right, exactly. You've read other books, but yeah, he befriended Stephen Leacock, who was getting on in age by that point in time, but still.
Young at heart.
And he befriended another poet that we've discussed briefly, A.J.M. Smith, who was part of like the so-called Montreal group. And I already think that that's really interesting because you see O'Hagan straddling the old and new, right? A.J.M. Smith was very much a representative of the modernist sensibilities that were emerging in Canada at the time, right? Especially poetically.
Mhm.
Whereas Leacock very much represented the Victorian sensibilities, right, of writers, as you know, right? Very Victorian, Edwardian writer, right? I don't know if I would go that hard, but yes, sometimes, yes.
We love the Edwardian age.
So much fun, so gay,
So romantic. I love icebergs.
I love that they're melting in this period.
I love
We'll
that
continue to
I
melt.
love that they're ramming into ships. Yeah, you didn't think you were going in for the Titanic, did you?
No, I was
Just like
leaning
the
into
ship and the
environmentalism.
iceberg.
Let's go.
That joke hit you like the iceberg did.
Thank you. Just keep them coming. Keep them coming. So he actually, O'Hagan actually practiced law without actually being called to the bar, and he pretty much quit law practice for a bit, and he became a tour guide at Jasper National Park. And here's a connection to you.
Jasper National Park.
Yeah, great national park. It's awesome.
Yeah, I used to had to phone into them for safety stuff. Anyway.
Oh, that's awesome. But yeah, like again, just kind of early sensibility into what would become Tejon, right? So you got Leacock and Smith, and then actually working as a natural park guide. But he would also travel to Australia, right?
Hey.
Heyo. So that's where he began to write short stories and really become engaged as a writer. And upon his return to Montreal, Stephen Leacock came back into the picture in order to help him get a job with the CPR, right? The Canadian Pacific Railway.
Mm-hmm.
Which for O'Hagan, his job was to basically recruit farm laborers from England. And he would also continue working for various railways, including the Canadian National Railway and the Argentine Central Railway, mostly as a publicist.
Yeah.
Right?
So he went, hey, farmers, is farm work too labor intensive for you? Come work out on the railroad.
Or come work in the easier farms of Canada? Question mark?
Cold, snow. permafrost that is no longer permanent because of the melting icebergs.
Literally in this case.
Yeah, I know. Literally, because we're talking about books. My entire existence feels very postmodern sometimes.
I mean, that's good. I feel like living a postmodern existence can either be the most radical thing, or you just feel like the most alienated subject possible.
Or at least when I get on the show and I start talking, I feel my ramblings feel very postmodern.
Good. I think that's good. I think if there's one medium that's postmodern, it's podcasts.
Don't even get me started on the evolution of digital mediums. I've been thinking, like, the shit that goes through my brain on the topics I consider, we won't get back to mister O'Hagan, and I'll feel really bad because I'm going to forget how to pronounce his name.
No, it's fine. Go off. It's our show. We can do whatever we want. Go off, King.
Yeah, but no. So to bring it back to Howard, I was going to say Mark O'Hagan. I swear to God, I was about to say Mark O'Hagan. The dude has a superhero name. I will say that much, and that gives him bonus points.
That's true. So actually, as a lot of Canadian writers do, it was while he was living in the United States that he began to write stories about Canada. Right?
Fucking, that's how you know you're a Canadian artist.
You write in the US or Australia or England.
Oh, you just do all your actual art outside actors, comedians, singers, songwriters.
Yep, absolutely. But that's what's interesting, right? It's like you see, right? Obviously, the history of Canada is by and large a history of east to west, right? It kind of broadly goes that way. Obviously, this is an overgeneralization, but
not by
it's
much.
interesting that, so because as a West Coast writer, by the mid 20th century or early 20th century, he's still adopting this practice of going abroad in order to write, which in the East Coast was already no longer a thing, right? So you see in Montreal, Toronto, so on in the Maritimes, writers are starting to stay in their provinces,
and they're starting to write big journals, and they're going to publish these journals for a little bit. They're going to get 12 issues, and then the journal is going to collapse in on itself, and then they're going to start another one.
Yes,
and this time it's going to be different,
right? But regardless,
and then Pierre Trudeau is going to write in the journal.
Yay! Our good old always comes back.
Our liberal king.
So, but so you do see still in the 20th century this move being performed, right? Even as artistically, a lot of the themes that he's going to address and that other writers like him are going to address are very contemporary. The practices and literary forms are still beholden to that tradition, right? And again, I think that's emblematic of O'Hagan as this figure who's straddling the old and the new. I don't know if I'm overreading this. That's just my way of articulating it. I don't know if you agree that it's an overread or not, but I'm launching that information out there.
I love it. Good for you.
Okay, great. Thank you. So while he was in America, right, as I mentioned, he started a series of notes, actually, right, and thinking about things like Mounties, the trappers, indigenous people, or these mountain.
Gee, I wonder what his book's going to be about.
Yeah, I'll give you like 3 chances if you want to figure out what Tejon is.
Progressivism, the encroachment of man onto the wild spaces, the displacement of natural forces.
And who's the main character, perhaps?
Probably a fucking logger railway man or something.
You're close. It's an indigenous person, actually.
Oh, there you go.
Shockingly, for the time.
Yeah.
Right? Which, it's not as bad as you would think it would be.
So remember,
it
folks,
was written.
If it's a white man writing about indigenous people, it's going to be a really poorly written book about. So it's because here's the thing. Go back to what we were talking about earlier. If you're looking at what the story's actually about, if it's a white person writing about women or cultures or races not their own, then that's not what the book's actually about. Because if you make that what the book is about, it's going to end up being racist because they don't know what they're doing. So instead, you have to make your book about some kind of general ass nonsense like the dangers of scientific progress and environmentalism.
I think Taejon goes beyond that, but by and large, I would say you're right.
Mm-hmm.
I think Taejon is really an exception. Not to say that it's a perfect novel as far as representation is concerned, but I think it stands apart as far as what other representations of indigenous environmental issues are.
I was mostly just taking the piss anyway.
Oh no, it's good. You should take the piss. It's a actually good point. But I'm just like trying to shoehorn it back into this book. So yeah, all of these experiences, right, of taking notes about the Mounties and his odd jobs as a railway worker and so on, would culminate into Taejon, which is his first novel, and not a very long novel for listeners who don't have it in front of them. I'm just looking at it here. Without the afterword, it's exactly 200 pages long, right? So very readable and short. But this was pretty much his only success as far as a book was concerned. He did continue during the 50s to write as a journalist for newspapers in British Columbia. And he would kind of take odd jobs here and there on the waterfront, on survey crews, that type of stuff. He would even live abroad for a bit with his wife. He lived in Italy, in Sicily. And ultimately, in the mid-70s, he decided to settle permanently in Victoria, where he would kind of continue to write for the rest of his life, despite poor health. Right? But again, none of his other books hit as well. Right? And because of that, even his most successful book, Taejon, kind of faded into obscurity. Right? Just because no one was thinking about him anymore. Right? By the time he semi-retired and was being ill in the 70s, the novel had been published almost 40 years ago. Right? So 40 years is a long time where writing is concerned. So people just kind of left him out of their imagination. But among writers who were interested in literary history or in their own influences, O'Hagan was still a force to be reckoned with. So, for example, famous writers like Margaret Lawrence or Ken Mitchell would push to make him an honorary member of the Writers' Union in Canada, and he even received an honorary degree from McGill University, right, for his writing and for his influence. And even on a prose level, the book Taejon would come to have an influence on people who we've talked about before, right? Obviously Michael Ondaatje, but also on people like Rudy Weeb or Jack Hodgins, right? So beyond the themes, right, as a style writer and as a prose writer, very influential. So yeah, that's just a bit of context. Took half an hour to do the context, but whatever, right? That's
I was kind of taking you off the beaten track there.
Oh God. Do you have anything that you wanted to add about like this context, this immediately post-war context as far as writing is concerned? That right? Like that.
No, because I think it is actually really important, and I think that's why he faded so much into obscurity, is that he was like a good 30 years behind the trend, really.
Interesting.
Because you can
ahead of the trend or behind?
Behind the trend, because you can see that in his friendship with Leacock. Like, he was friends with these guys who were writing about expansionism and blah blah blah, when like that post-war 50s to 80s period was very much more in a different phase of Canadian writing.
Yeah.
And so he kind of didn't make it because he was writing for a Canada that was already gone.
Yeah. And even like obviously when we were talking about the West Coast, right, it's later, right, that its history as far as literature is concerned is a little bit delayed compared to like the East Coast, which is again a generalization but not really. And even by then, by the 1930s, expansion had kind of finished towards the West Coast, right? We were much more interested in the North, right? Where we're starting to expand northward in Quebec, Ontario, and so on into the territories.
Yeah.
And so even on that level, yeah, I can see thematically why he wouldn't be as important. Yeah,
But it's also
absolutely.
even the expansion. A lot of our expansion used to be driven with this idealized, romanticized viewpoint of like a new frontier, frontiersman, blah
Mhm.
blah blah. Like that didn't exist in the fifth
Yeah, that's true.
expansion, or even the 30s and the 40s. Expansion was much more just like disillusioned, and it was much more
Mhm.
just not. We're just going there because we got it at this point. We got to get more resources, build up our war effort, get ready for the Cold War.
Yeah.
And then the in Canada in the 60s becomes essentially dominated by the French movement,
Mhm. Mhm.
realistically
Yeah.
speaking.
Civil
Like
rights.
yeah, exactly, civil rights. And obviously West Coast is very different, but even then it's still
Mhm.
like it's gonna be same but different flavor.
Yeah. And so that's the thing, right? Again, to kind of point to this straddling that he's doing, thematically kind of behind the times, stylistically ahead of the time. And so he's just
And that
not quite fitting.
postmodernism.
Yeah, exactly. And a lot of his style of writing would hit after the war, right? Which again, I understand why he would kind of fall into obscurity just by that fact,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, absolutely. Um, good.
But I would also see why his writings would then become very academically and critically well.
Exactly, which is exactly what happened, right? Or at least Tejon. Tejon has received quite a bit um, of academic attention, right?
Mm.
I actually completely by coincidence because I pulled out this book for my dissertation and not for today's episode, but I was reading parts of a Robert Croce collection called The Lovely Treachery of Words, which is just a series of essays, and he has a whole essay on Tejon,
Mm-hmm.
right, in it. Um, and so it it does demonstrate just how, especially for West Coast writers like Croce, this novel would have been in the back of their minds at the very
Yeah.
least, right? And
Yeah.
and would have been worthy of interest. Um, I'm gonna actually come back to this essay because it's actually really good. So we'll um, so yeah. What just to kind of get into the context of the novel itself as a piece of art. Um, one of the readings that I read was that Tejon was possibly influenced by O'Hagan's reading of Joseph Conrad, right? Which, again, another novel that is a complicated history, right? To say the least, Heart of Darkness, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is both stylistically a very modernist text avant la lettre, right? Before it was cool to be a modernist text, but also thoroughly racist. Right? So um, I think, or at least what some people are saying, is that O'Hagan kind of grabbed onto this contradiction within the text of stylistically interesting but thematically complex or
Yeah.
complicated, right? And kind of turned it into a Canadian version of that. Um, and just to give a very brief summary, Tejon is about what the novel calls a half-breed native, right? So his name Tejon is actually a linguistic corruption of Tête jaune, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yellowhead would be the literal translation here. And Tay is welcomed as this kind of new messiah, right? Who will lead his people across the Rocky Mountains to be reunited with the people of the BC coast. And you can, for people who know their history, you can kind of maybe see some inklings of Louis Riel type of messianic figure. Um, I actually don't know to what extent O'Hagan would have been aware of this aspect of Riel. I never came across anything or in my cursory research that mentioned
Yeah.
that explicit connection. He may have been aware of it and just not mentioned it explicitly, but for us modern readers, you can kind of see that connection.
Mm.
So it's about at its core, that's what it's about, right? This kind of messianic indigenous figure, right? And specifically at the beginning, or the way that the novel is structured is that he's actually born in his mother's grave. And by the end of the novel, Tejon will fully disappear into the earth, right? With the body of a pregnant woman. And
Mm-hmm.
so just just with this like narrative arc that I described, right? Of starting in the earth with a dead woman and finishing in the earth with a dead woman, very much demonstrates O'Hagan's mix of environmentalism, mythology, and magic that he kind of infuses in a rather
Right.
realistic fashion into the entire
Right.
novel. Right?
Okay.
It's not straight up magic.
No.
You'd maybe call it like magic realism if you want
Mysticism.
to yeah, mysticism is a good term, I think, right? It's
That
not
that
quite.
okay. That hits on the kind of shit I love. I
Yes,
love that kind of like
I know
pseudo
you would like
magic
this novel.
mysticism.
So, okay, so explain why mysticism is interesting in this context.
It's just because it's almost magic in its own way. We've sort of created to understand as a science, like all magic systems have a way, they have rules, sets, blah, blah, blah. We understand this happens, you wave your wand. Mysticism still touches on that very much unknown element, that unknown, unseen part that just leaves you very confused or not quite sure what you're dealing with. It very much still touches on that part where you reach the bounds of your understanding. And I think that's really interesting. Like, don't get me wrong, I love a good magic series. I love a good series with magic and a good magic system. I think there's a lot of really interesting, but mysticism just carries with it that little bit more.
I really think that idea of mysticism is a good one, and especially one that's relevant just before the war starts, right? In the early 20th century, which, this is not the only novel to do this, but I think implicitly you're coming to that idea, right? Of science encroaching into the world and breaking down what we understand as magic, but we still want to approach something in mystical fashion because it makes the world much more interesting.
But also, I find it almost gets you closer to actually finding any kind of truth.
Yes. Truth with a capital T.
Yeah. I mean more in like the alchemical sense of the truth,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So yeah, just to kind of push this a little bit further, this way that the book begins, right, with Taejon's like really ostensibly miraculous birth, is also a mix of indigenous traditions. I heard some critics call it Shuswap traditions, but then also it incorporates more Christian theological components, right? These, again, the element of a miraculous birth is par for the course in Abrahamic religions. But as you're pointing to with the mysticism, you kind of inevitably lead into questions of what are some of the modernist concerns about truth or identity or history. And something that Robert Croce brings up in his essay is that it also leans into questions of irony and the transformation of the self and the world through that irony. And yeah, that's kind of a very broad outline of the text. I obviously can't give like a beat for beat summary in this episode. I do recommend that people read it. And yeah, I think we'll just lean into some of the quotes from the text, and I think we can kind of parse them out, and we'll
do it.
Cool. Let's do it. Do you want to read some, or do you want to?
I can try with.
Do you want to start? Cool.
Sure.
I don't know if you have the PDF up.
He had just walked down the toboggan behind him, under the snow and into the ground.
So
we love a toboggan.
Yeah, that's literally the last page. The first quote that I pulled up was from the last page of the book, because I think it really demonstrates what the novel leads up to.
It also is very Canadian.
Yes. Okay, go on. Explain.
Well, even just using the phrase toboggan. Like you go anywhere else, it's a sled. Get your sled out. We're going to go sledding. It's the same way in Canada we use the word toque. Toque, toboggan, other such Canadianisms. It very much plays into that. I also think it's just like he had just walked down the toboggan behind him under the snow and into the ground. It's interesting. He's not riding the toboggan down. He's walking down with the toboggan in hand. Mm-hmm. And then he just goes under the snow like he's an animal burrowing underground.
Yeah.
Imagery.
Imagery.
Metaphors.
So this is where it gets a little bit complicated, right? Because I don't think O'Hagan is antagonistic towards indigenous issues,
Mhm.
right? Um, right, and I think Tejon is obviously the protagonist of the novel, and he's meant to be someone that you root for as an indigenous figure, which again, not common at the time. And
Mhm.
yet, this is where it gets complicated because you're right in pointing to the animalistic nature of this burrowing into the ground, which
Mhm.
rightfully a lot of critics have pointed, just as more generally, not specifically in relation to Tejon, have pointed to how we tend to animalize figures that are non-white, right? You
Yeah.
see this well, you see this in actually Conrad, right? In Heart of Darkness, the way that the Congolese people are animalized.
Well, I think it's more primalizing. Like,
Yes. Okay, that's good. Yeah.
yeah, because I just think like you have to consider, they're very much reverted to primal. It's always like just hunting, hunger, fight, sex. In the case
Mm-hmm.
of women, like it's less that they're made into animals. They're very much still portrayed as almost like human, like, but just humanity at its most primal state.
Again, I don't. That's not to say that we can't have this criticism. I don't think O'Hagan meant it as a criticism, which can either be read two ways. Either we're being unfair towards O'Hagan, or it demonstrates how this kind of ideological
Well, it's
uh,
almost it's
aspect is
it's in the
infused
same way
quite
that
naturally.
people like there are storytellers I've seen where they try and view people of color as these like powerful mythological figures of their
Mhm.
strength. And it's like that's still in its own way not okay. It's just
Yeah,
not
it's problematic in
malicious.
itself. Yeah.
Yeah, but
Mhm.
it's not malicious.
No, exactly.
And I think
Yeah.
that's what you can probably say about O'Hagan.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and we can come back to the sexuality aspect. I pulled up another quote here because it does come up in the novel, right?
Of course it does.
This prime, yes. But again, I think he kind of subverts it in an interesting way, or at
What a
least a notable
bear.
way. Hell yeah. But no, what was I going to say? Yeah, the toboggan thing, of course, like typical symbol of Canadianness, right? Of Canadian childhood. And it's
Yeah.
something that, yeah, and it's something that is actively rejected by the end of the novel as he goes back into the earth from whence he came, right? Um, and there's something really interesting about that. Oh, I mentioned this a few episodes ago. I forget. Oh, it was in the episode that we did on Hector de Saint-Denis Garneau, the poet, the Quebecois poet. Um, where like a lot of romantic poets will do this, where they are trying to get back at the feelings of wonder from their childhood and can never quite achieve it because they are adults now, right? And they
Mhm.
are jaded by the adult world. And I can't help but read this passage as a send-off um, of this kind of move, right? Where you can never quite go home in a metaphorical sense, but in this case, Tejon is managing to literally go home in physical sense, right? And that says a lot more about
Mhm.
cyclical and material component of life, and I think that's really interesting. Yeah, I don't know if you had anything to add about this particular passage, but I think it's cool.
No, and I think I think you hit it all on the head pretty well.
All right, I'll read the next one. This one's on page 80. Let me pull it up. Um,
Is this
so
about
this
the
is more
axe?
toward, yeah, the axe one. Um,
Tay John, before they could reach him, swung the axe high and brought it down in one clean sweeping motion, clean sweeping blow upon his left wrist resting on the table.
I'll just finish the paragraph. I didn't copy it all down. McLeod said you could hear the click as it bit through the bone. Yeah, and again, it's this act of self-mutilation here, just for the context of the novel.
Mm,
Um, he, it's symbolically speaking, where this comes in is an attempt by Tejon to renounce the world that's governed by European ownership and property
mm,
logic, right? Um, yeah, as I mentioned in the notes, it specifically this is in the context of a card game that's being played.
yeah.
Um, and this case, because you need hands to play this card game, this symbol of ownership and chance, right? brought on.
He's
later.
removing chance.
Yeah, he's removing chance, and he's removing his ability to engage with such aspects, right? Because you need your hand in order to.
Yeah.
Really shows, I think, how. Well, again, it kind of gets at the animalizing or primal nature that we're talking about, which can be read either for positive sense, because on the one hand, you can see this as an act of resistance, right? Being willing to sacrifice parts of yourself, vital parts of yourself, in order to resist these oppressive forces, right? On the other hand, how many animals in the animal kingdom do this, right? Where when they're trapped, they gnaw off parts of their bodies.
Well, I also think there's something to consider in the symbol used of the axe, which is a very like indigenous weapon.
Okay, go on.
Well, and then especially like I don't think seen at that time they would have conflated sort of tomahawk axe together, and I think that.
Oh yeah.
So the fact that he's using a very indigenous tool, or what could be seen as a very, because if you're swinging an axe one-handed, then it's a small axe, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a fact that you can't swing a big clunky axe with one hand.
It's not a woodsman's axe. Yeah.
No, it's a small like trimming axe, which again would be very similar to an indigenous axe. And so I think that idea of using his own tools might have been part of what Hagen was going for.
Yeah. And there's something to be said, right? Especially in colonial literature in like the 19th century, we'll say the tomahawk as this symbol of fear, right? You often portrayed like the savage Indian, quote unquote, as someone who is going to come at you out of the forest with their tomahawk in order to scalp you, right? That was part of the horror. And in this case, the Indian does come out with the tomahawk, but not directly against the colonial power, right? But against himself as a way against the colonial power. So yeah, I think that all ties in really well. And it also ties in, of course, with the idea of sacrifice, which comes up again in a different context in the question of Christian mythology.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is where I'll let the next. We're going to skip the one on 203 just because we already kind of talked about it, right? His mother was buried pregnant, and so he goes into the snow, right? This is just part of Ondaatje's afterward, but we already kind of discussed it, so we'll skip that one. This is on page 167, where one of the fathers, or the priest, the main priest in the story, is brutally attacked, right? And the passage reads, "He was impaled upon the tree like time upon the hour. The arms upon that tree were still outspread, waiting to embrace the world." And in this case, the he is Father Rorty, and he was just grotesquely crucified against it. Which, of course, right, there's obviously the main Christian iconography happening there. Of course there is. But of course, it ties in with this whole element of what do you sacrifice? Right?
Yeah.
In the context of the novel, right, animals go on to dismember and attack him, right, as he's crucified. So there's this element of nature kind of taking over from man once more. And I mean this, and I mean man in the both capital M human sense, but also man as in patriarchal sense, which is an element that comes up in the novel. So I think this kind of ties all of this together, right? Of the subversion of Christian sacrifice as being virtuous.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas O'Hagan through Tejon is subverting this and saying like it can be really problematic, right? Because this logic is also very destructive. Right? It's been destructive of the environment. It's allowed people to self-destruct, and it can lead to some really horrifying things, right? And in this case, it's kind of martyrdom that's been reappropriated by the Canadian wilderness. And again, kind of ties in with the whole irony thing that we talked about, which is par for the course for modernism and postmodernism, where the sacrifice means nothing. So yeah, I didn't write the whole quote down for the one on 125. Did you find that one or?
125. Da 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 da. Indeed, to
So
tell a
one,
story.
yeah, yeah.
That's all I got.
But yeah, yeah, the rest of it. Indeed, to tell a story is to leave most of it untold. You mine it, as you take ore from the mountain. You carry the compass around, you dig down, and when you have finished, the story remains. Something beyond your touch, resistant to your siege, unfathomable, like the heart of the mountain. You have the feeling that you have not reached the story itself, merely assaulted the surrounding solitude.
Mhm.
Yeah, classic. This is where I think it gets most into the classic romanticism of Canadian literature, right? And I'm not saying this critically, but I'm just using this quote as an example of all the things that the text does, right? It does subvert some things, but it also points to some of its more classical elements, right?
Yeah.
Literally associating stories with mining, right? Which is kind of what O'Hagan is doing, right? He's mining indigenous stories in order to create his own story. He's mining colonial stories in order to create his own story.
But
So it's
not great.
not great, but also it's postmodernism in a nutshell, right? You're
That's
taking
true.
from a little bit of here and there and just kind of making this pastiche of it. And it's this
It's like
moment where the narrative point,
nostalgia.
bingo bango, it's all nostalgia for sure.
Nostalgia is postmodernism. It is art.
It's Watchmen. It's a perfume.
It's a performance. We live in a society.
Okay, I know you're getting tired, so I'm not gonna we're not gonna stay.
Getting tired? I am
And
tired.
so
Sick and
let's
tired
finish
of
off
the
with
lack of respect for my man, Howard.
we're gonna finish on two quotes that I feel are interesting. One that brings us back to the sexuality part that you
Mhm.
mentioned before. So as you might expect, Taejeon is at some point in the novel accused of sexual assault because he's an indigenous man, right? And so he's animalistic and primal, and that's part of it. Um, so this is on 107, right? His accused, Julia, says he imposed himself upon me. But only a few pages later, right on 115, she declares that Taejeon was a good man and did everything did everything for us that he could on all occasions.
Mhm.
I just wanted to bring up this passage as, again, pointing to these like conflicting components, right, and dichotomous components of the novel, but also tied it into the whole tension of gender power that obviously ties into natural exploitation and racialization of people like Taejeon.
Right.
How this kind of both reflects the colonial tropes of the quote unquote savage, but subverts them, right? By O'Hagan very quickly telling you, no, he actually wasn't a rapist, right?
Mhm.
Like, contrary to what the colonial standard would tell you, indigenous people are not depraved.
Yes.
Um,
They are their own. And again, I think that plays back into what we were saying, the non-malicious take of it.
mhm. Yep.
Like he was just doing his best.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we can't expect him to be like the most perfect man ever, but
No.
there's clearly an interest
Yes.
in a more
Yes.
legitimate way.
Yeah.
I think O'Hagan is doing something interesting where he's aware that whether you're indigenous or whoever you are, right, you have your flaws, right? And he's trying to balance this thing of creating a character that has flaws while also not at the same time falling into the colonial trap.
Mhm.
It's very easy to do. And I think by and large he succeeds. We've kind of talked about how sometimes it's a bit sketchy or maybe can be interpreted otherwise, but I think by and large he does a surprisingly good job
Mhm.
of doing that.
For
balance.
sure.
The last one I wanted to bring up, this is on page 72. Do you want to read this last one, the one on Stain?
It was a great wandering black stain, like the map of Russia. I have to eat off it. It's on the floor, too. Blood on the floor. I tell you a while ago, this place stank with it.
There's a few reasons why I brought this passage up. So we've talked about the map making, violence of map making. I think this passage really brings that up, right? Of like how the imposition of borders onto places is an inherently violent act.
Yeah.
But also as something that's extremely hard to get out of, right? It lingers with you no matter how hard you try. And this is something that I think is really surprising to see in a novel from the 1930s, right? You hear about this today of like, oh, land back, right? The land back movement of wanting to give or let indigenous people have more sovereignty, but then the issue always comes back to how do you manage the border after that? Right?
Yeah.
And it becomes very, very hard to dissociate yourself from that logic once it's stained to the wood, like this passage gives. And I think it's a surprisingly prescient passage. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring it up, and also because it's stylistically just a really impressive passage that gets at O'Hagan's capacities as a prose stylist. Yeah, I don't know. Did I convince you to read this book?
I mean,
if ever,
maybe one day in the future.
Yeah, I
well, because I also
people-
like this because it feels again very Shakespearean in that way. Like it reminds me very much of the Macbeth moment.
Mm-hmm.
In that very common running motif of blood on the floor, blood is a stain. So it gives it again that very sort of classic storytelling. And again, Macbeth was a very mysticism type of story.
Yeah, I think O'Hagan is one of those early novelists that you're starting to see in Canadian literature at this time of really being able to integrate your influences, like Macbeth. I'm sure it was on his mind when I think he's able to integrate these influences and interests without being overt about it. And I think this is really something that you're starting to see in Canadian literature at this time that he does really, really well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
That being said, I think that's all. I just wanted to highlight this cool novel. Really, that's all I wanted to do. Right? Awesome. I think it's important in the history of Canadian literature, and I think more people should read it. What the next episodes are for people who are interested, right? So obviously, Mac, you're going on vacation when exactly? Remind me.
Saturday, and I'll be gone till July 10th or 12th.
So I might record the next episode alone. So I'm not gonna do William Lyon Mackenzie King episode alone because I need you on that one.
Gotta rank our prime ministers.
So yeah, I'll do like one on Norman Bethune or something like that for the next episode and do it.
Cool.
Oh, or I'll have Camille on as a guest for the women in Quebec.
Yeah, there you go. A little couples episode.
Oh, that would be cool. All right. So before Mac falls asleep on the pod, thank you everyone for listening. If you want to support the show, you can check out our Patreon, our very reasonably priced Patreon. It's less expensive than a cup of coffee per month. So check that out. And by the way, we actually did get a new Patreon between the time that we recorded our last episode. Sam, if I believe, my memory serves.
Sam the man.
Sam the man. Yeah. Yeah, Sam. Absolutely. So thank you, Sam, for joining to the Patreon. And yeah, we should be recording a new episode of Pop Canada soon.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right. Oh, also, apologies for people who are listening on YouTube. Our latest episode, you would missed it because YouTube demonetized it because they saw that we were talking about fascism and did not recognize, the AI did not recognize when we were quoting from people rather than actually expressing our own opinions. And so it thought that Mac was a racist.
Mm-hmm.
So YouTube sucks. So if you want that episode, you'll have to like go onto the Patreon, not the Patreon feed, but the just the regular podcast feed on Spotify or whatever. Sorry
Yeah.
about that.
Whoopsies.
Yep. I tried to condense it, but YouTube didn't want to.
Oopsies.
Yep. All right. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time on a cultural history of Canada.
Time slip.
Cheers, everyone.